Okay, so here we are at 586 BC. We've seen that Daniel prays 49 years into the diaspora. Now look at this. The deadline for the second temple, this is why Daniel 9 is worded the way it is. The deadline for the second temple to be rebuilt, notice that God says there's 70 years in Daniel 9:2. The deadline is 516 BC. That's when the temple has to be rebuilt. Alright, dedicated. Because remember, it was dedicated at the last minute. It goes by the dedication date. It was dedicated at the last minute, 950 BC, when the 490 from Moses ran out. Notice, David's personal 490 runs out in 513. 3 years later. Now the reason why you got 70 years is because 70 sabbatical years were missed. But that wouldn't have been the deadline if David's personal 490 from his united kingship didn't extend farther. Notice the other deadline of David's united Hebron, his Hebron kingship start, is 520 BC. Temple construction begins just a year before his own kingship began. So there is a tie there. In other words, a beginning to a beginning. These time grants, when they run, and the deadlines that are imposed, are based on the character of the time grant. This is his kingship Hebron start. Okay, before that 490 runs out, the temple has to start again. So it does, a year before. All right, and you see the verses on the screen. Now, the finish of the temple has to finish before David's united kingship starts, because the temple represents his kingship. So it's analogous to the Civil War period that he had. All right? So, 516 happens to be the deadline that intervenes because of the 70 years. Now, the next important thing to notice is that that's being done because we are coming into a voting period. First of all, of course, obviously David met the qualifying 490. All right. We're coming into a voting period right here from 3640 to 3710. There won't be any voting period to be had if there's no temple. All right. But there is a temple by 516. But if you look at Daniel 9, the wording is two-pronged. It's not just the rebuilding of the temple. It's also the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was not rebuilt by 516, but the temple was. So the next deadline in Daniel 9 has to do with the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Now, because God mirrors time, because this 70-year allotment or deadline was met in 516, another 70 years can be granted for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And another reason why that can happen is because David's 490 from his kingship retirement and ending, the ending of the building of Jerusalem, the ending of, the start to rebuild it actually. You got his kingship retirement, but that deadline doesn't play so much into the history of what happened. But this one does. David's personal 490 from his death. Death is an ending. So Jerusalem has to be rebuilt. Okay? With the 70 years being granted, it sort of overlaps. Because you got, how do I want to put this? This is where you see the interplay between David's personal 490 and the temple 490. All right, David's personal 490 would end 473. There wouldn't have been a Jerusalem to be rebuilt if Esther hadn't married Xerxes I. It's because Esther married Xerxes I in 478 that about 4 years later, when the Haman conspiracy went on and was defeated, as a result of the Haman conspiracy being defeated, you had Jewish advisors to the Persian kings. And that continues on down, actually through Darius. Okay. Now, David's 490 was protecting Israel in the diaspora still, but the temple is up. So that's why you have this overlap. You have, in essence, the 490 continues on the temple because it was rebuilt in time. But you also have David's 490 protecting that time. That's how God can justify the accounting that he does in Daniel 9. And when you look at how he does the accounting in Daniel 9, you'll see he crafts it from the shortage between 586, when the temple was destroyed, and which should have been the end of the temple's 490, which was the same year as the 490 ending of David's kingship retirement. See, 950 to 480 is 490 years, and that is protected by David's 490 from his kingship retirement. I'm sorry this is so complicated, but that's the way the blessing of time works. So you got 950 to 480. God was tying David's kingship retirement to the same year that had the first temple gone on, because God foreknew when it was going to be established. Had it gone on, all right, it would have ended there. Now, where is that 460? No, I'm sorry. Temple ending is 460. I get confused too, see? All right? So there's an interlapping between the temple 490, which is needed, and David's protection. The temple had to be rebuilt for David's protection. In one sense, David's protection allows the church to, the temple to continue. On the other hand, the temple has to continue for David's personal protection to continue, as you see right here. Well, actually, the temple's still protected because of the 490 running to 473. The temple 490 should have run out 460 BC. It is protected while it gets rebuilt, while Jerusalem gets rebuilt by David's personal 490s. And of course, the historical 490 ends here. So if this hadn't happened, and if this wasn't protecting, there wouldn't have been of this. Of course, this is actually later than David's, so only the temple's 490 continues from this point forward. All right, this is the end of the temple 490 had it never been destroyed. Obviously, the plan of God was that, by granting it in 950, which ran out from Moses, here it would have met the 490-year deadline historically from Adam. Okay. So in 473, David's ran out. In 474, the Haman conspiracy was destroyed, as a result of which there was a Nehemiah and Ezra and all those guys, and that's how Jerusalem could be completed, its rebuilding completed, by 446, because the temple is up and running. All right? And when God crafts the temple's new 490, he takes what was left over from it dying too early. See, it should have died here. The end should have been here. There's a 126-year difference. And some of the 126 years accounts for the 70 and the 49 and the leftover 7. I'm going to get to the leftover 7 in a later video. But right now, the 70 and the 49 come from that. Now, when God says 62 weeks, that's coming from the number of years the temple was standing, because it was standing 364 years, plus the 70-year voting period. If it was standing another 364 years, a 70-year voting period would be allotted to it, and that's what 62 weeks equals. Do the math, you'll see it yourself. Okay. Now, Jerusalem gets rebuilt in 446 BC. Notice that now you see the interplay of Moses' personal 1,000. Because there is somebody, in this case the temple, alive with a 490 running, in this case the temple, because it got reinstated. Therefore, the 1,000 protection is valid, so Israel's getting extra protection from Moses' personal 1,000. Because David's ran out, the only timeline that's left, the only 490 that's left is the temple, and that only because it got rebuilt. So here we are in the voting period. Now, this is really important, and you only know this if you plot the numbers. We're in a voting period from 3640 from Adam to 3710 from Adam. During that voting period, Israel voted enough to rebuild Jerusalem. Moses' 1,000-year personal protection ends 440. So just in time, Jerusalem is rebuilt. So Israel voted enough as a nation to rebuild the temple, that was back here, and to rebuild Jerusalem, that's here. And if you read the accounts of it in Nehemiah and Ezra and Malachi, you'll notice that they had a great deal of trouble. In fact, by 397 BC, they were so apostate that canon had to be closed. There was no more revelation to be given. But at least they voted enough to be there, because that's the new criterion. When it shifted to Israel, Israel had to be there. Israel had to be a nation. They have to vote corporately. They stopped voting corporately. They rejected God in 1050. That's how come it shifted to David. Okay, from David it shifted to the temple by the time Moses period ends. Okay, but then they reject God again, so the temple has to be destroyed, but they vote back for God again, protected by David's time grants. All right? They vote again, so the temple is rebuilt in time. Meanwhile, Messiah's exact birth date is predicted on what will become Hanukkah, but they don't know that at this point. And David's time grants are protecting, and therefore Jerusalem gets rebuilt just before Moses 1000 ends. And at that point, when Moses 1000 ends, it's during the voting window, so Israel has voted enough. It's still apostate, but it voted enough. All right, so at this point, only the Temple 490 keeps the world going. That's the comment in row 150. That's it. So now all history is going to focus, all Satan's efforts are going to focus on destroying the temple. Okay. In order to set up to see how Satan tries to destroy the temple and the parameters of that and the impact, we do kind of need to go back to the time measure. Remember what it says in Daniel 9. God's accounting is not the way people think it is, and that's why they get screwed up about when Christ is born. They first of all don't know the time rules about the grant to David, and that's the basis for what God says is in Daniel 9. They also don't know about the 490 measuring from Adam, and that's another reason they don't understand it. Okay, so let's just go through what God is actually saying there, and then you can prove it before God yourself whether or not this is accurate, okay? 586 BC is when the temple is destroyed. First, there is a 70-year grant to play out the sabbatical years because they are important for the world to continue. Okay, the 50-year Jubilee is based on the sabbatical years being observed. In cell A2, you can click on the Word doc for that and look at its item 9 in page 14 of that Word doc, and that will walk you through the exact math of how the sabbatical years buy Jubilee, the 50-year period of Jubilee. Okay, Jubilee always depicts the end of time. And if Jubilee can't play, then time ends early. Again, this is all precedence for the rapture. But let me just walk you through the timeline. 586 BC is when the temple is destroyed. It has to be rebuilt by 516 because that finishes off the 70 years missed. Now, as it were, it's a balancing transaction that God is using in Daniel 9. The 70 years that were supposed to play do, and that's why Daniel waits until 49 of them have elapsed. Okay? Because that takes into account the number of years that were due from the actual time the temple was standing. Because the actual temple was standing for 364 years, from 950 to 586. So he can't even pray for this until 538, because the sabbatical years have to, have elapsed. So that all the sabbatical years that belong to this period from 950 to 586 have now played by the time Daniel prays in 538. The total number of years, is from 586 to 516, so they've only got like 20 years left. Well, a little longer than that. Yeah, about 20 years left. Okay? They managed to do it in time. David's 490 runs out in the year 520 a year after. 516 is when they dedicate it, which is okay because his United Kingship personal 490 ends 513. God is taking all this into account when he gives you the accounting in Daniel 9. So 586 and 70 being met, the sabbatical years being played, they buy time. What do they buy? They buy another 70 years. So they're buying 70 years from 516 to 446, which is the deadline for Jerusalem to be rebuilt, which is okay that rebuilding occurs after David's last 490 runs out, because the temple is standing and now it has its own 490. Okay? The 490, as we saw, gets tacked on with a voting period of 70 years. That predates Israel. The sabbatical years represent the voting period. So that's why the count in Daniel 9 goes from 586 down to 4 BC, which is more than 490 years. And even then, God's only allotting 483. He's reserving 7, and you're going to find out why in the next video. All right, so we've got the first 70 being met, gets mirrored, replayed, replenished, restored, redeemed. Therefore, another 70 can intervene and play before the temple's own 490 countdown actually begins. And that because we're in a voting window, and the 70 years represents the voting window. So the reimbursement of the second 70 puts you smack dab in the middle of the voting window. Israel votes positive, so the voting window can complete, and it's still protected by Moses' personal 1,000. So that's why it can complete, plus the temple's got its own 490, okay, which is restored. That's why God does that piecemeal accounting with the 70 and the 49. The 49 covers the period to complete canon. That's when the 49 starts. The 270s we just saw. Okay, from here to here is 70, and from here to here is 70. Then the 49 kicks in here. That's why he's listing the pieces separately. All right? And the 49 kicks in here, and when it ends in 397, that's when the 62 weeks starts. And that takes you down to 4 BC. Now, well, it takes you down to 4 BC, but it also takes you down to 37 AD. And I got to go through that. And that'll be in the next video. Right now, I just want to focus on from the time that the temple and Jerusalem are reestablished. Satan's big goal is to get rid of the temple. Now look at, we're coming on the end of the 7th historical 560 from Adam after the voting period closes. Only 200 years later is the end of the 8th contiguous qualifying 490. Now the temple has to stay up or time ends. So Satan's desperately trying to get it not to stay up. That's why you see history being what it is, extra-biblically. And biblically, but I mean the canon stops here at 397, so it's mostly extra-biblical. That's why history is so turbulent during the 400 BC forward. That's when you have Alexander and all the Persian, the Greek-Persian thing, and then Alexander finally takes over from the Persians. They go down, and Alexander rises, and the whole business with classical Greece, all that going on to try to counter and take over Jerusalem. And basically, from Alexander forward, which was 323 forward, the Jews aren't even still their own nation. They are basically giving tribute to Greece. And Greece has varying degrees of peace with Israel, but this guy named Antiochus Epiphanes IV, he wants to get rid of the temple altogether. Yeah, well, Satan wants to get rid of it. So he does this pig sacrifice thing in the temple. He also sacrifices human Jewish babies there, between 15 Kislev and 25 Kislev. Now, he had to have picked those dates on purpose. Okay, and they tie back to The dedication, that's the construction, the dedication of the founding, because that's when Messiah's birth date was predicted. So I don't think Antiochus did that, by accident. I think he did it to try to snub, say, oh, your Messiah is never going to come, I'm the Messiah instead. And that's why he does the pig sacrifice thing. Which, of course, Daniel is caused to know back in 538 BC, before the temple's even rebuilt. And that lasts just as long as, I think, I forget the number of days that it says there. I think it's 2,335 days. I might be mixing that up with Daniel 11. But it's either Daniel 7 or Daniel 8 where he talks about the exact number of days that Antiochus is going to end up being there before they overthrow him. And when they overthrow him, that becomes the civil holiday of Hanukkah. And unknown to the Jews today, Hanukkah represents the Messiah's birth date. Okay? Alright, so Hanukkah is instituted in 164. Israel doesn't become her own nation again. The Maccabees fight. The Maccabees are usurpers. They were a priestly caste to begin with, but they try to pretend that they're the kings too. So you got two fake messiahs going on here during this time. You had the fake messiah of Greek guy, Antiochus Epiphanes. This is precedence for the two antichrists in the Revelation. And then you have the fake Jewish messiahs, which are the Maccabees. They were okay at the beginning, and they became very corrupt at the end. And they took over the temple. The whole business about how you appoint priests changed. You didn't even end up having real Levites as priests. That's the problem that the Lord talks about. The Lord doesn't talk about it. The Bible talks about it in Luke 1. That's one reason why John was born. He was a true Levite. There were some Levites in there, but most of them were not. Okay, so that's the countdown to Christ. That's what characterizes the period, is trying to destroy the temple and who's got control of it. And basically, the apostates got control of it. So it kind of stays an abomination from 167 forward, but it's still standing. So time can continue. Alright, because not everybody was apostate in Israel. Okay, so now we come down to, I'm not sure that this 1,000 based on his birth is a valid number, but this one is. Okay, Christ is born late in 4 BC. Alright, that is tantamount to 3 BC in math, so just count it as 3 BC when you're doing your subtractions. That's the 1,000th year anniversary from David's united kingship start. So Christ starts in the 1,000th anniversary of David's united kingship start. Now he's going to be allotted time, but I've got to stop the time and cover that in the next video. To show Christ's time allotment being equal to David's, we need to sort of begin with some review. Okay, David becomes king of all Israel in late 1004 BC. He retires in 970 BC. That's a total of 40 years. Okay. 1004 minus 970. I'm sorry. That's a total of 40 years when you include the Hebron kingship. 1010, sorry. 1010 to 970. So that's what is going to get mirrored to Christ. Alright? Now, the next thing you have to notice is that when God does the timeline to Daniel 9, he's doing it based on David's death, which was 963 BC. 1,000 years after that is 37 AD. Keep that number in mind. Now, if you'll look at Daniel 9:24, you'll find out it's God doing the decreeing, so it's not a human king's decree, which is going to follow. That's a big mistake scholars always make. The other thing that they mistake is they don't know the rules of time, so they don't understand that there are two 70-year periods that get tacked on, because the basic accounting unit is a 490 plus a 70-year voting period. That's where the sabbatical years come from, as we see here in this example between 3640 from Adam's fall and 3710 from Adam's fall. So when you look at Daniel 9, and you might want to pause this video and go pull it, Daniel 9:24, announces that there's going to be the 490. And then in Daniel 9:25 and 26, it's broken down. 483 years of it are allocated, but 7 years is left out. Let's first walk through how the 483 years is booked. Okay, you got 586 to 70. That's not mentioned in the 490 because it's not part of the 490. It's part of the tack-on to 560, part of the voting period. They missed the getting to the voting period because their temple dies early. It was supposed to die here in the voting period of 460 in row 145, but it dies too soon. So God is basically balancing the books to get it back on track to where it should have been if it hadn't been destroyed. Therefore, you have to add to the total timeline that's depicted in Daniel 9:24 and 25 two reimbursements. The first one is 70-year reimbursement for the 70 sabbatical years. That's in Daniel 9:2, which is quoting Jeremiah. Okay? After that, assuming, and of course it happened, that the 70 years requirement was met, which it was, by 516, then there's a 70-year to reimburse. And notice how that puts you back into the voting period. So God's balancing the books on time. And He's doing it on time. All right? So you got 586, 70, second 70. Now, from 446, which is the second 70, now the 490, 483 years, kicks in. Now, it's accounted in separate pieces because some of this 490 is to make up for the fact that the temple died early. It's got 126 years left to run. So we saw a 70, all right, accounted for here, reimbursed here. So that really belonged to the first temple that now got played out. It gets reimbursed because it's successfully completed in order to get to the voting period, which is a tack-on. It is tacked onto the 490 in God's accounting anyway. So He didn't have to mention that to Daniel. Daniel knew about it. So now we're here in the voting period, and now the other piece, the 49-year piece, plays from 446 to 397. That's why you see 49 listed, because 397 takes you to the end of the voting period. You see? It takes you to the end of the voting period. God is balancing to the voting period that was supposed to be there. So the canon is completed by the end of the voting period. Obviously, they had to vote for the canon to be written, and it got written in time. I mean, because Messiah's going to come, there's got to be a book. All right, so after that are the 62 weeks, which are considered the silent, intertestamental period. And the reason why those 62 weeks can go on is, look, 950 minus 586 is 364 years. Again, you have the tack-on of a 70-year period. So 364 plus the 70 takes you to 37 AD, the end of David's personal 1,000 based on his death. Now, since Messiah is predicted to be born in 4 BC, from 4 BC to 37 AD is his allotted time, predicted in advance. And everybody would have known this when David died, because this is the same ruling period. 40 years David ruled, 40 years Messiah will be alive, and he's got to complete his mission in that 40 years. All right? So they know that the outer limit of time before they start, the outer limit of time is 37 AD, period. And that is basically why the 7 years that we call the tribulation are outside the timeline. Because there's this, and then this, and then this, and then this. The 62 weeks takes you to 37 AD. That's it. That's the end of allotted time, because the 1,000 is now interfering. All right, Christ has to renew time. That's what Paul says in Galatians 4:4 that Christ came at the end of time. Literally. I mean, very often the Bible should be literally interpreted. It's literal. At the end of time. There's the end of time right there. Row 171. End of David's personal 1000. Therefore, God has to leave dangling the extra 7 years because the time grant has to be in a 490 unit. But there's 7 years of that 490 unit which are stopped by David's end of time for his death. So this is where you see where 1000 interferes with the 490. Sometimes the 490 deadline interferes with the 1000, as we saw up here in David's case. The 1000 from Moses wouldn't have been able to play if they didn't complete the temple by 516. There's that deadline from David, and there's that deadline from David. And of course, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, which was granted due to the 490 that the temple got, is occurring in a voting window. Okay, Moses for 1000 ends later, but guess what? If Jerusalem wasn't completed, it wouldn't have mattered about Moses 1000. So here down here we see the reverse. David's 1000 interferes with the grant of the new 490. All right? It's really basically because of Daniel 9 that I learned all this. Because it's just flat balance accounting, and I do accounting for a living, so it's like, oh, this is familiar. So that's how come I know. Well, basically, for other reasons too, I'll cover later. All right, so we're now into. I've got to kind of hurry up with this. It should be at this point, after you've heard so many of these videos, and I'm sorry that they're kind of complicated. But God's accounting for time is complicated because He wants every dot to count. So here you've got Christ being born on the 1000th anniversary of David's united kingship start. And He dies, remember from the previous videos, He dies in the 1000th anniversary of David's retirement from kingship, which was 970 BC. 30 AD, the Jews had rejected Him. He's dying 7 years earlier than the allotment given Him, which was based on the 1000 based on David's death of 37 AD. Okay, so if you're an accountant, you ask the question, well, wait a minute. If this is the allotment in Daniel 9, and it is, but Christ dies in 30 AD, and He does, then what happens to that extra 7 years? Here, baby. It plays out to destroy the second temple exactly on the same timeline as the first was destroyed, from 64 AD to 70 AD. Okay? Now, that accounts for the 37 and the dangling of the second 7 years. Remember, the tribulation is still in reserve. There's a second 7 years to account for between 30 and 37 AD, because that was allotted within the 490. The rest of the 490 is outside David's border of death. All right? So that second 490 that was inside plays from 64 to 70. Now, if I can get that note to go away. David's death and the 1000th anniversary of it was when Christ was supposed to die. There was a schedule that was being depicted by that. That schedule was depicted since Moses. They just didn't know in what millennium it would occur until David died. They knew from the year David died forward that in the 4143rd year from Adam, the rest of time was supposed to play out. From 4150 to 4200 was supposed to be the harvesting of the Gentiles. That's represented by the 50-year period of Jubilee. 4200 was supposed to be the end of time. That's why Isaiah 61 is talking about Jubilee as an advent. There were two advents, of course, Christ coming first and claiming Isaiah 61 when He comes. And this is what they knew. All right, so from 4143 to 4150 is a 7-year period. It actually is going to play between here and here. But that 7 years was represented by Passover's week. So there's 7 days from Passover. After that, you start counting the Omer. And then the Omer ends. You stop counting it at Pentecost, which means the harvesting of the Gentiles. The millennium of Christ. Christ was supposed to return, according to this initial schedule, having died 37 AD, he was supposed to return and institute Israel as, queen of all the nations in 4200 AD. 4200 from Adam. All right? That was the schedule. All right, so the 57 years not being played out because of Jewish rejection are represented by a 57-day doubling when the temple is taken out from Passover to 9th Ave in 70 AD. So there you have the accounting of what was supposed to happen. The 7 years that was outside, that's in Daniel 9:27, was supposed to play from 4193 from Adam to the 4200 year of Adam, when the return of Christ as king this time, taking over and winning, defeating all Israel's enemies. That second advent was supposed to occur in 4200. But because Israel rejected him, church got inserted instead in 30 AD. Now what that means is that all time resets at 30 AD. So all the 490s are measured from that point forward, and at this point I'm going to stop the videos. This is the conclusion of the timeline. Hopefully now you see the genesis of the Time Lords.